turning them on.
Oh, well, why don't I wait until you get...
They're on.
Okay. Bill Stipp will not be calling in on the work sessions, but he will be calling in on the regular session. And Gary Gilzer is still out of the country. So with that, I'm looking around the table, and we need to have an official roll call. So I believe the rest of the council is not here.
Except for
Where's
Joanne.
Does anybody have any idea?
Saw her an hour ago.
1, 2, 3, 4 of us. So.
4 out of 5, that's a quorum.
And that's, yeah. You're
Is that
good.
all right?
Yep.
Okay, well then we're just going to go ahead and start and hope that Joanne is, she's coming? Thank you. So then let's just wait one moment then. Is that all right, City Manager?
Certainly.
But I will say the agenda item we're going to discuss is the management review of the Goodyear Police Department as completed by Citygate Associates, LLC. Citygate's Associates and the interim police chief will present status of report recommendations. And Manager John Fishback.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. This evening, we will introduce Jim Davis, who is a retired Chief of Police of El Cajon, California, and Steve Harmon, who is retired as Human Resources Director after 32 years and most recently in Livermore, California. Before I do that, though, during March of 2011, Chief Brown, Mark Brown, announced his retirement. On March 30th, I appointed Chief Bill Kusan as the interim police chief. On April 12th, we hired Citygate, and they were hired to conduct a review, a management review of the police department to improve the management and the leadership of the department. Tonight, the project team will present their key findings and recommendations. The project team consisted of 3 people primarily, and that's Jim Davis, who is here this evening. As I mentioned, 34 years of public safety experience. He held every position in the El Cajon, California Police Department, ending as the chief of police. There's 312 people in the department and a $24 million budget. And Steve Harmon, who is a retired Human Resources Director of Livermore, California, has more than 32 years of experience in all aspects of human resources. And the third member of the team was Jim Evans, who is a retired city manager, and he had 30 years of experience in city management. The review included the following areas: the officer training and professional standards of conduct. Secondly, policies for officer involvement in alleged violations of law and or policy. Third, internal affairs and discipline. Fourth, criminal investigations division and audit review. Fifth, leadership, management, and communication. Sixth, management control systems. And seventh, limiting department liability. The project team met with staff, reviewed policies and procedures, and conducted over 60 interviews during the week of April 18th. 35 of these interviews were from randomly selected police officers and people in the department, and 25 were by virtue of their positions in the community and or officers who called and volunteered to be interviewed, and they wanted to be interviewed by the team. The report contains recommendations in the study areas mentioned. The police administration, under the leadership of Interim Chief Kusan, has reviewed each of the recommendations and formulated an action plan and assigned a project manager for the implementation of each. As you will hear, approximately half of these recommendations are already in place. And so many of them were seized upon by the interim chief even prior to the audit being completed by Citygate. Citygate's report identifies a path for improvement and will assist the next chief in their ability to push forward with effective management and leadership of the department, of the Goodyear Police Department. Meanwhile, Chief Kusan and the men and women of the department have aggressively taken the helm and pursued the implementation of the recommendations quickly and effectively. Several changes are worth mentioning, I believe, at this time. First, the chief reports directly to the city manager rather than to a deputy city manager. Paul Merzaka, as you know, was named as a commander of the police department. to replace Ralph McLaughlin. The second commander position was kept vacant in case the interim chief, goes back to that position or whatever, but the other personnel are therefore reporting directly to the chief. Such people are also somewhat of a change from the management structure, and that's the PSU, or the Professional Standards Unit. That is going to report to the chief at all times, but Bill immediately implemented that change. Other changes have been made. There were 2 retirements in the department, 1 resignation, and 2 demotions. We have appointed 3 acting lieutenants and 3 acting sergeants. The testing process is now being initiated to test for those positions, and that will take several months to get through that. I think it's important to remember and acknowledge that Citygate's recommendations have been very helpful to us, but the police department identified many of these problems themselves and admitted and acknowledged the mistakes that were made by the department, and we began changing policies right away. We have made the necessary personnel changes and taken the necessary disciplinary actions. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve, who will lead the presentation of the Citygate findings. Steve?
Thank you. Mayor, members of the City Council, thank you for your invitation this evening to come and speak with you about the work that we've done in your police department. I'd like to begin by just making a couple of important points. Each time that we have done a review or a management review of any of our clients, the typical response that we often hear is that, well, I've read your report. Is there anything good that goes on in this particular agency? And I'd like to begin my comments, and Jim, I know, concurs with this, by pointing out a couple of very important points to you. Despite the challenges that you have ahead of you and those that you have already addressed in your police department, this community and this organization should be grateful to the fact that it has a police department with as many fiercely loyal and dedicated employees as you have here. Many of the people that we interviewed during the course of our work, even though they expressed concerns about leadership and management issues of the department, are fiercely committed to this organization, to your organization, and to this community. And I think that is the foundation by which you are going to be able to move forward. So I hope that you keep that in mind as you do that. A couple of other preliminary comments is to express our appreciation on behalf of Citygate to the city manager and to your interim police chief, Chief Kusan, for their outstanding cooperation that we received when we were here in April. As you've heard described, we had a very ambitious work plan when we came on site here with the number of interviews that we did, and we were treated very, very well by everyone in the department. The people that we interviewed were incredibly open to us and very candid with us about their opinions and their views about the police department. The other point I want to make to you that is important to keep in mind as you hear our presentation this evening is that when you do a management review, as we did, what we're basically doing is taking a snapshot of something at a point in time. That is to say, we don't go back and do a large-scale historical review. Our recommendations that we made are designed to help improve in those areas that we noted in the report we think requires improvement, but it really is a snapshot of, it's a picture. And our job is to take the pieces of the puzzle and put them together into a coherent, understandable framework for you to move forward. And that's, I believe that we've done that. In all, in our report, we have made 31 basic findings and recommendations to you, and in some of those recommendations, they're multiple parters. So I suspect if you counted them all up, they would be in the area of 45 to 50 specific recommendations. With that, we can jump into the first slide. Our presentation to you this evening is going to focus on 4 basic areas. First, we'll quickly take you through what the study focus areas were. Second, we will review with you the methodology that we use to get to bullet point number 3, which are the major findings and recommendations. We also want to provide you with an opportunity to ask us whatever questions that you may have about our work. The study focus areas, as your city manager has just gone through, is first as we looked at professional standards of conduct and officer training. We also specifically looked at policies for officer involvement in alleged violations of law and/or policy, and that was done specifically at the request of the city in this case. We also spent a considerable amount of time looking at and examining the department's internal affairs policy as well as its disciplinary policies and procedures. We also examined in detail the recently completed management review of your criminal investigations division. As a generalized topic, we looked at what we call management control systems in the department, how employees are directed, supervised, managed, and led. We also spent a considerable amount of time looking at leadership, management, and communication processes within the department. And finally, we looked at ways that we think are prudent in terms of limiting departmental liability as you move forward.
And just as a note, the Citygate's findings and recommendations are confined to those that pertain to the department as a whole, and not to one or more of its subcomponents, rather than the present or past performance or conduct of individuals within the city. This was a review of systems and procedures, not of individuals. Our report is intended to identify opportunities for systemic departmental improvement and not to assess past personal conduct. This distinction is important since it clarifies the purpose of Citygate's contracted scope of work and contracts Citygate's project with the investigative work being conducted by others. So it's a contrast. We're not looking at people or their conduct. We're looking at the overall systems.
The methodology of our study entailed 3 basic components. Prior to our arrival here to do our field work in April, we had requested and received a great deal of documentation from the police department with respect to existing policies and procedures and other documents of that nature. That comprised well in excess of 1,000 pages of material that we went through prior to arriving on site. We felt it was important that we have that information prior to coming down here, in part because it helps us frame what our management review process is going to look like. The second component of our work was to develop a structured questionnaire that we could use to help us obtain the information in each of these study focus areas of our review. We spent a considerable amount of time putting together a questionnaire that was comfortable for people to respond to, and yet at the same time was rigorous enough to provide us with reliable information that ultimately could be used to frame our findings and recommendations. Finally, our on-site work here in in April entailed extensive interviews with both sworn and non-sworn staff. We spent a considerable amount of time with the command staff and with your interim chief, as well as talking with selected members of the community.
So, especially in the interest of time, because I know our time is very limited, we have a number of these to go through. I'm not going to read the bullet points, but rather just comment on them as we go along. First, also, let me echo what Steve said about the reception we received from both the department and all the city officials with whom we came in contact. sometimes when you come into someone's home and you start digging through all the little issues, people get defensive. But we didn't find that here. We found people who were eager to cooperate, who laid out things for us, before we could ask for something, it was sometimes anticipated, well, if you might need this, here's where we're here to help. So we appreciated that. In terms of the looking at training, we look at it from a couple of different standpoints. One is that the training that was required. And so from a requirement standpoint, we took a random sample of officers, we included officers, detectives, sergeants, and lieutenants, and found that they were in substantial compliance or above compliance with the Arizona Post requirements. So that's a positive thing. So the required training is being done.
Excuse me, can I interrupt you just a moment? Can you hear him in the back? Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I see you
Speak
looking.
more into the microphone.
Yes, into the microphone. Thank you.
So the officers were in substantial compliance with the post requirements, or above that in most cases. We found, however, that the training was focused on operational issues primarily, and with only casual input from the leadership of the department. And one thing we need to be very clear about, this is not a criticism of the people who were involved in the training process. We found that they were doing just a phenomenal job. This is really an issue of management setting appropriate priorities for what kinds of training the department needs. And to that extent, we found that it was largely a casual process and left really to a single individual to make that decision. There we go.
Thank you. As it relates to internal affairs and discipline, our finding is that investigations are conducted according to procedural requirements set forth in the department's policy. We were also made an observation regarding the reporting relationship between the internal affairs function and the police chief. And the best practices is that there be a direct reporting relationship between the IA function and the chief of police. But what I'd like to point out to you is that if you do have the report handy, if you take a look at page 24 for just a moment, there's a table number 6 that I'd just like to call your attention to for a moment. One of the questions that we asked the members of the department that we interviewed was, are the Goodyear internal affairs investigation procedures fair, impartial, and effective? And one of the interesting data points that we came upon was the difference in ratings that people in the department had based upon their years of service. Officers with less than 10 years of service in this department had a much lower score in response to that question than did those who were here for more than 10 years. And you'll see throughout our report that's a recurrent theme in a number of areas. Also, when disciplinary action is taken as a result of an internal affairs investigation, it was clear to us that those that were taken were done for just and reasonable cause. In other words, there was a legitimate reason why discipline was taken. It's very well documented. It shows what rules were violated, how the rule was violated, and it was appropriate and done in accordance with the internal affairs policy. We did, however, as you'll see in just a few moments, make recommendations at the request of the city as to when an internal affairs investigation ought to be done internally or externally. And also we addressed the question as when should an officer be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. And we made some very specific recommendations, which we'll talk about a little bit down the road.
It is. It's not uncommon when dealing with almost any organization to find concerns about communication. It's when you begin to find a lot of patterns that occur that you become somewhat concerned. For the Goodyear Police Department, we found the process of communication between ranks was was inconsistent. That there were some people who were working very hard at it, but that there was at least, if not a reality, a strong perception on the part of those people whom we interviewed that they weren't being communicated with. Officers lamented the lack of contact with some sergeants and most lieutenants and above. Now, there may be a lot of reasons for that we can discuss in terms of the decentralization and other issues, but this was a primary concern of many of the men and women with whom we spoke. The process of accountability for the distribution or training on the content of new or revised policy was lacking. And very inconsistent as to some sergeants spent time with their officers discussing the policy. Some sergeants directed their folks to simply read the policy at their convenience, and there seemed to be no set process for which these things, or how which these things would be distributed.
We actually passed over one slide a moment ago. That was
One back.
one back. That's it. One of our tasks in our assignment here was to review an audit that had been done internally by the department on the Criminal Investigations Division. And we were asked to review that audit and to make a judgment as to whether or not we felt it was an appropriate audit in terms of its review of the management control systems that were in place at CID a while back. And the conclusions that we reached is that was as thorough and complete an audit as you could possibly have done. We have a good degree of confidence that the conclusions that were reached and the recommendations for changing various procedures in the criminal investigation unit will in fact fundamentally result in the improvement of that division. And if you take a look in our report on page 42, table 17, you can see that there are a number of areas in the Criminal Investigations Division that have in fact improved quite dramatically. There's still things that are awaiting implementation, but those changes that were made as a result of your internal audit of CID really have had a positive effect on that unit's performance.
So in terms of the management control systems, I think that the operative word here is the one confidence. That evaluations always serve as a way for the organization to convey its view of the degree to which the employee is meeting the city's expectations, areas of potential improvement for the employee, a career planning process for the employee, a tool for instruction and charting progress towards professional competencies. Promotions, transfers, all kind of form around this idea of a strong process of evaluating performance. We found evidence supporting the original intent of the current evaluation process to be a tool to get employee input, that is, having the employee do some written process to determine this is how I see myself currently. That process, while probably well-intentioned in the beginning, had morphed into a process by which employees were being now required to write their own performance report. They were given a report and said, please fill this out. And then that report became the de facto performance report with little or no input from the first-line supervisor. I think we go back to this idea that there is no more important process within any organization than that of hiring the right people and then determining that people are doing the job that you've hired them to do. Where they are doing well, we praise them for that. Where they are doing something that we don't want them to do, we provide correction. And then that provides the basis for saying that this person is now capable of going forward and having more responsibility in the organization, or perhaps needs to have some other direction. But performance reports are a foundational document. They are the lifeblood of a healthy organization, and they should not be left to the employee to fill out. And to their credit, I did a ride-along, a couple of ride-alongs actually with officers. And to their credit, the officer said, I don't want to do this. I want to see what I'm doing well. I want to see what I'm not doing well. I want to know how I can progress in this organization. So there's a desire among the people with whom I spoke to do something more beneficial for them and more beneficial for the city.
The second point on that slide is important as well, is that when we were here back in April, what was described to us as the hiring process for entry-level officers was delegated to lower-level supervisors or managers, and at that time, the chief was not involved in discussions related to, or interviewing more specifically, of candidates for police officer jobs in this department. We saw that as a weakness in your hiring system, and we do know that that's already been addressed. I also want to point out to you that one of our major findings was that there didn't seem to be, or isn't, a great deal of confidence in the department's promotional and assignment practices. As a matter of fact, if you look on pages 56 of our report, we had asked everyone that we interviewed the question, do you believe that transfers and promotions are made based upon merit? And using a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest score, the average score was a 4.375. When we looked at the data again, sorted by years of service in the department, we see that officers with less than 10 years of service had even lower scores of 3.95, and even officers who were more senior with 10 or more years of service had scores of 5.45. We would have expected to see, if there was a higher degree of confidence in these processes, higher scores.
Excuse me, can I ask a quick question? Could any of that, I don't know the questions that you asked pertaining to this, could any of that been based on hiring freezes or just, the lack of funding for the past several years of being able to actually promote, or was this just more of a level of confidence that they would be seen as being someone to promote?
It's a level of confidence in the processes that were being used. We did not ask, nor did we receive information pertaining to the points that you raised about hiring freezes.
Okay,
But I think it was pretty clear to us that it was the latter.
gotcha. Well, without evaluation, that doesn't help, does it? Yes.
Right.
You can see by the color of my hair and sometimes the lack of it that I've been doing this business for a long time, and so I have seen things change a great deal. I am awestruck at what we expect from our young men and women now in law enforcement, the decisions that they have to make. They alone exercise enormous discretion on our behalf every single day. They go out and make decisions at 2 o'clock in the morning that we have to sit and ponder for days to try and figure out if they made the right one or not. So the job that we are asking them to do is a tremendous one. So we have to be sure that our training programs are robust and well-rounded and up to the task of not only providing them the kind of training that prepares them to take action, but perhaps as importantly or more importantly from an officer safety standpoint, the kind of training that helps give them the direction and the guidance of how to make the decision to take action and what kind of action to take. That's why one of the reasons why we focused on this idea of incorporating different kinds of training. We also consider that what we currently have as to the second bullet point as to the department's training program should be led by senior executives. This goes back to one of the things we talked about before in terms of one of the most important responsibilities that executive leadership has is to make sure that the men and women for whom we're responsible understand what really the values of the organization are. Values are a foundational aspect of developing the vision for the organization. That vision that's developed helps inform the mission of the organization, and then that gets you to the idea of setting goals. But without a foundation of values, we all come from different backgrounds, and without a strong understanding of what the expectation is of the values of the Goodyear Police Department, the city of Goodyear, the citizens of Goodyear, then we're missing a significant component of that well-rounded training policy.
Okay. With respect to our recommendations concerning internal affairs and discipline, our major recommendation is that internal affairs needs to report directly to the police chief, and access to files should be generally restricted to the chief and the internal affairs sergeant. We acknowledge that from what we've understood that recommendation has been implemented already. Best practices on internal affairs, it's absolutely essential that there be a direct and unfiltered reporting relationship between an IA sergeant and a police chief. There can't be any interference in how an internal affairs investigation is being conducted, but between the IA sergeant or lieutenant, as the case may be, and the chief of police. A review process of whether or not, if there's a finding where there's an allegation that's sustained that merits discipline, then it's certainly appropriate to involve command staff in deliberations and discussions about what that disciplinary process, what that disciplinary action might look like. But in terms of the investigatory process, that line has to be a straight line, and it has to be an unfiltered line. With respect to the Criminal Investigations Division, we noted that in your internal report that there was a very strong recommendation made to develop a training program specifically tailored to the needs of employees assigned to that division. And in particular, what motivated us to make that finding was that the internal systems that are being used to track cases in CID is a fairly robust and complex computer system, and that through our interviews of individuals assigned to CID, they expressed concern to us about their technical skills to use all of the functions of that system, and hence training is an important element to make sure that that system is functioning at its full effectiveness.
With regard to a report review procedure, many law enforcement agencies have adopted a philosophy that I wholeheartedly subscribe to, and that is patrol is the heart of any organization. Patrol are the people who are in patrol, the people in uniform, the people that are out there at 2 o'clock in the morning, which is always my standard. What is that person at 2 o'clock in the morning driving that black and white? What do they need? The people in patrol are the people who have probably the best contact with the community on a regular basis, have a good pulse of that. With regard to where you begin the process of suspending in criminal investigation cases, it is not uncommon in many departments for a patrol supervisor to have the authority to suspend a case. Now, by that I mean that we've taken a report, but there's just absolutely no follow-up that can be done, or all the follow-up that can be done has been done by the patrol officer and is documented as such. Now, there has to be good coordination between investigations and all other divisions who would be the recipients of those reports, including traffic and other divisions. So there has to be good communication back and forth between them. But there's nothing wrong with having a patrol have that kind of ability. In fact, that even enhances their sense of responsibility for the crimes themselves, because if I'm putting my name on a piece of paper that suspends a case, I better know that it's been done correctly. Now, that does not preclude, however, the appropriate distribution of information to the respective divisions or individuals, or the inclusion of that information in some sort of a statistical database that can be used for comparison and appropriate tracking of crimes and so forth. But what it does do is it puts a little more responsibility back on the patrol officer, which most of us believe that is one of the areas where it belongs, because they're the ones who can. The quicker you can begin to deal with the crime itself, the more chance there is it's going to be solved. So it's a good appropriation of resources.
And our final recommendation in this area was to give consideration to and review the possibility of changing the reporting relationship of the Criminal Investigations Division from its current reporting relationship to the Support Services Commander to perhaps examining the possibility of having it report to the Patrol Division Commander. There may be reasons why that can result in even more improvement and better coordination among those two divisions. But again, that's something that has to be thoroughly evaluated, because it's not a simple yes or no answer. There are a lot of complexities associated with making that kind of a change, but overall there might be some benefit to both Patrol and CID if that happens. So we simply recommend that you give it consideration at this point in time.
One of the unintended consequences of rapid growth and non-strategic decentralization can be a loss in communication or the ability consistent reporting relationships. Lines of communications, levels of responsibility that have not been critically considered. Only with the luxury of time do we have the opportunity to look back and see and evaluate what we're doing, why we're doing it. Does it still make sense under our current set of circumstances? Operating out of a number of locations without an emphasis by executive management at the Goodyear Police Department has found that communications has been a challenge. Consistency, one of the things we heard consistently for many of the individuals from many of the individuals with whom we spoke was the idea of accountability, fairness, and leadership, and consistency. So consistency, accountability, fairness, and leadership, almost in that order, but almost to a person they came up with the same things. This lack of communication seems to extend also with external partners, because some of the things we heard from some of the department's external partners were some of these same kinds of issues. Now, there is some consideration that, well, perhaps this is a generational thing. Maybe we're just dealing with generations who want different things. But there is a body of research that would indicate that even with generational issues, that these same sorts of things appear in organizations that are having some trouble, that consistently across ethnicities and across generations, you find many of these same issues at varying levels of importance within about a top 20. They will appear someplace in that study. In terms of the leadership and management and communications training, as we had discussed earlier, has been largely operationally based. And again, I want to emphasize, this is not a function of a criticism of the individual who's in charge of training in any way, shape, or form. I find that individual to be a consummate professional. This goes back to the direction set at the executive leadership. And in any organization, the executive of that organization has to set the tone for what they want the organization to be. And that comes in discussion with the members of that organization. But at some level, the direction in which that organization goes lies with that executive. The so-called, quote-unquote, softer skills and their relation to officer safety have not been prioritized in the training operations for the Goodyear Police Department. Training should support those things we talked about before, that is the values, vision, mission, and goals. And that is a function of the executive leadership of the department, along with input from the specific area experts within the department, and that starts at the newest officer all the way up, about what is needed and how that is to be then. How do you prioritize those very limited training dollars to make sure that you're getting the very best value that you possibly can for that training.
Our recommendation regarding management control systems and liability also includes responsibility for the development and implementation of the entry-level, promotional, and specialty assignment testing should be transferred to the HR department with appropriate input from the police department. I want to just clarify a point on that. We actually look at this as a shared service responsibility, not that one department maintains responsibility for the entire process, but both departments play an important role in a sharing environment to produce the desired outcome. And the desired outcome that I think you want to have in a hiring process, in a promotional process, is actually quite a simple one, and that is you want to have confidence that your systems and procedures in place are sufficiently designed and rigorous to produce the best qualified person for the job. That's your outcome. That's your measurement. How you get there, there are multiple ways to do that. I also want to make the point that the officer who is currently assigned to this function in the police department has done an exemplary job with the resources that he had to work with. He's managed complex hiring systems, and he's done that extraordinarily well. What we think needs to be added to the conversation about the hiring process is the technical expertise that an HR professional can bring to the conversation. For example, what kinds of tests are most appropriate to be administered to measure what kinds of competencies that are necessary to do a particular job. Those are the kinds of skill sets that an HR function can bring to the conversation, as well as lending support in the management of a system that has multiple complex steps to it. So we view this as a shared responsibility, and hence that really is our recommendation at this point. Finally, we had made the recommendation, and we acknowledge that there's been implementation of it, is that all new hires in your police department ought to be interviewed by your chief of police before the final appointment is made. We also made a recommendation with respect to your performance evaluation process for the reasons that Jim was talking about a moment ago. It's absolutely essential that employees have confidence in the evaluation system, and our concern is at present that confidence level was not as high as we think it should be. And we think that when a system is redone that provides officers with the type of input that's necessary for them to grow and develop, you'll see an enhanced level of confidence in that process. We also had some concerns that we identified in the report with respect to how policies were being reviewed and updated. And our basic recommendation is that that should be a function of a policy committee that's represented from all ranks in the department. We think it's an absolute strength of this department that your policy manual, in fact, does have review dates associated with each and every policy. And we did note that in some areas that there's a little bit of slippage on that. But yet, the benefit of having a committee do it is engagement of employees at all ranks in the department. We think that's important to do. And second, it's also ownership. And three, it's a vetting of the proposed policy, and we think those things are of huge benefit to the department. It helps answer the question for rank and file employees is, why is this policy changing? And people, employees want to know the why, and we think that this approach will help address that point.
Madam Mayor, would you like to ask some questions or have the chief give a response to what we're doing and then have questions.
I'm going to ask the council, because this is for you this evening and for the public. How would you like to handle this? What makes you feel most comfortable?
I'd like to hear from the chief first, personally, because it might answer some of my questions.
Okay, do I have a consensus on that?
Well, I guess my question I have is, we got to kick the meeting off at 6, right?
It's immediately following this work
it's
session.
okay.
There is not a requirement to start at
Okay,
6.
perfect, then I'll hear from the chief first.
All right, Chief?
Okay. Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Back on March 30th, I met with the city manager, and I was tasked with making some appropriate changes within the police department internally, looking at different investigations to start, looking at better processes to put in place, and basically develop tools to make our management team more successful. We did identify critical concerns by the staff that were addressed immediately upon me taking office. Those concerns, most of which are consistent with recommendations made by Citygate. And you'll see in your notes that you all have that in no case did we disagree. Matter of fact, we concurred with all of their recommendations and their findings. Citygate's recommendations with our concurrent progress is confirmation of staff's commitment to excellence. And when I say staff, I'm speaking to the rank and file up to the chief's office, that we are committed to success. What we took away from the Citygate findings, we recognized that our charge as managers, we took away 3 specific things. Number one, we agreed with we needed to look at ways to enhance and to better our hiring practices. We understood that our charge was to invest in training, both in line-level staff and executive staff, particularly executive staff and leadership. We have taken steps already. As we sit here today, I have 3 of my executive staff members that are participating in leadership and police organizations training. The last 3 at the executive staff level will be attending the same course in March next year. So we understood that there was a need for investment in training, and not only in again in leadership, but we also understood the need for continued training in ethics, conduct, and professionalism. In October, or around about, we're meeting for our strategic plan update, which we're going to take a critical look at how to accomplish those goals. We start setting the goals that Jim had mentioned earlier in our strategic plan. So we do see the value in that investment. And lastly, to establish consistent best practices and support systems. And we felt it very necessary from the onset of this change in leadership that we work collectively and collaborate with our association and staff to come up with to develop a comprehensive professional standards policy. We have accomplished that, and all of our staff have been trained on our new policy. Some of the recommendations that Jim and Steve had spoke to regarding consistency is what our department needed. We needed consistency from the rank and file to the chief's office. As a matter of fact, after the policy was completed and approved, I took the policy to the city manager's office because he too is to hold me accountable for those policies and professional standards. We learned that going back to inconsistencies, to develop a sort of a loose matrix system with our new policy, which lends to mitigating and aggravating circumstances depending on what the violation is. But it gives the officers as well as our supervisors and a general idea of if you do this, this could happen. So it's a starting point. We felt that was very necessary. Some other support systems that we are currently engaged in is a partnership with a web-based firm on policies and procedures. They're a company out of California. They assist police agencies, over 1,200 throughout the United States with 65,000 officers, in developing best practices to lessen liability and risk to your department. So we're working with that team. Full implementation will probably not be for 8 to 12 months. It is a process. But those are the three major areas that we saw that we need to identify and what we actually gathered from the Citygate findings. In regards to the recommendations, you'll find that we have had a number of completed and in progress recommendations which we have given you responses to. There are a number of them that we've done over the last few months, and some of which we accomplished even before Citygate came on board. One that Mr. Davies refers to, the professional standards unit sergeant or detective reporting to the Office of Chief of Police. That is very much an industry standard, and we made that's just an example of an immediate change that we made. We do have still some work to do, and we recognize that. You'll find as we turn the page to some of our pending recommendations, they have been assigned project managers, and we are working to we are working towards being in compliance and following the recommendations, but it's going to take some time. You'll see that, given the current status of the department, resources has become an issue. Everybody is doing a whole lot more just because of what we have, what we've undertaken over the last few months. But we are working towards a successful resolution. And then lastly, we have some in here for project planning, which you'll notice the status is discussion, and that speaks to what Jim and Steve were talking to about the partnership with human resources. Absolutely, I agree with the recommendation and concur. We need to meet with HR and really get a look at what is that going to look like in 6 months when we have a new HR director. What part is HR going to play in this process? Is it going to be, a 50-50? That's still to be determined, but we are going to open discussions and get those accomplished as well. So with that said, I know we're running short on time, but if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those for you now.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I thought it was very thorough. I thought the information we all received, it had everything in it. And of course, I'll talk more about you later, but I'm going to open this up to council for discussion. So whomever would like to start? Jerry?
You're looking at me. I have a lot, if that's okay.
I'm looking at you. You're the lawyer of our group, so I'm looking right at you.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for your report. It was very comprehensive. As a former prosecutor and defense attorney, I do want to give kudos to the police department, and I do want to say I have never gone to court and heard a prosecutor say, oh, no, I have a City of Goodyear case. And I've never heard a defense attorney say, oh, yay, I've got Goodyear officers. So that is a compliment to the men and women who are out there, like you said, at 2 a.m. in the morning, trying to make those call decisions. I do have a couple questions, and I'm not sure which of you can answer, or maybe you both can. The first question I have is, and you even brought this up, the resource issue. Did it come across anywhere, because we have grown so much in the last decade, that any of these issues are basically underlined because we are undermanned or understaffed or under-resourced in any way?
What a great question. We didn't hear a lot of concern with respect to staffing except for patrol, which is where we did hear a lot of concerns on the part of patrol officers with respect to the number of officers that were available to respond to calls, and particularly in the night shift. So we did hear that. We think, however, that one of the factors which gets you to the place that you're at today is the explosive growth that this community has experienced. We took note of that at the beginning of our report. You had a 245% growth in population over about a 10-year period of time. And it's a challenge for any municipal organization to keep up with the demand for services when you have that growth level, of those numbers.
Let me just visit that idea of staffing, because we did not look at staffing specifically. And without a thorough examination of calls for service, what kinds of calls we're paying attention to, how those calls are prioritized, how cases are accepted or prioritized at varying levels, we wouldn't really be able to respond and give any sort of intelligent response to whether or not this is a staffing issue. I think I know we got the strong sense that really what people were looking at was that those 4 key areas that we talked about before of consistency, fairness, leadership, the 4 areas that we pointed out in the report, that those were the things that they were concerned about.
And then I have a question on, I believe it was page 28, and this is kind of why I asked about staffing. When we talked about some of the Criminal Investigations Division, I know that the city has taken some steps in accordance with the recommendations. I guess, where was it? Was it 30 or 42? It was your chart. I'm trying to see what. It was page 42. The clearance of cases. I didn't know if there was a further breakdown, because at 90 days we still had, even after the audit, we still had 42% of our cases. Apparently, is that not cleared total? Is that stuff that's been furthered back? Does that include everything if it's come back for more information from the county or something?
Let me just see if I can answer this correctly. In a case, although it may get an active tag, is not closed.
Okay.
So it may not be being actively worked by a detective, but the case is not closed. Is that?
So
Yes.
the number's still there, essentially.
Yeah.
It doesn't go away.
So that's what I was trying to get at. So it doesn't go away. So that 42% is a little misleading. Those could include cases where you just don't have any leads right now.
Yes, ma'am.
So there's no reason to work them. Is that kind of a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay, because it looks like a higher number when you
Yes.
read it. I just wanted to see what that was. And then I'll go around, because I think you answered a lot of my questions in how you're handling stuff. With the hiring practice, I know you really focused in on the hiring issue. Do we currently test for higher positions like sergeant, lieutenant? We currently test for those.
Yes, we do.
And what you're saying is we need to have someone with human resources experience revamp those tests?
Steve is the HR person in this, so I'll let him address that.
The department's current policy on promotions makes it abundantly clear that the responsibility for hiring rests solely with the police department, and that the development of the hiring methods that are used for any one promotion or assignment is done internally. Our recommendation is that process be a shared one between the department and HR to bring together the technical assessment or testing knowledges that HR people would have to work side by side with the executives in the police department to develop appropriate, fair, non-discriminatory, and defensible hiring and promotional practices. Hence, we did make a recommendation in the report that the city give consideration at some point in time to going through what we call a test validation process, at least for entry-level hiring. We think that's an important recommendation and something I hope that the department will and the city will look carefully at doing. Those are not cheap, by the way.
And just to follow up on that, then would it behoove us or be beneficial to us to have a HR person who has like specific law enforcement testing experience? Would that be something we should look at for an HR person as well?
My general reaction to that would be yes, you should.
Okay. I'll let
All right, we are getting close on time, so how do we want to handle this? Can we go over the time, and it's okay? I just want to check for the
It's
lawyer.
totally,
Okay, it's fine. Eric?
The next meeting doesn't start till after this one's over. So that's
Okay, so we're just going to continue on.
As long as
Who would
you
li-
like.
Thank you. Who would like?
If we might, just to add to,
Yes.
to your last question, though, because it's important that there be a shared responsibility, especially in the promotional areas as well, because we want to go back. We don't want to leave the importance of that specific area expert out of the process. And again, we're not just talking about promotion. We're also talking about transfers. So we're going back to those 4 key areas: consistency, accountability, fairness, and leadership. That consistency in if I want to go and if I want to test to be an investigator or a traffic officer or a SWAT officer, what's the process by which that occurs, and is it the same each time?
Again, consistency. Absolutely, it keeps ringing in our ears. Who would like to speak next? Joe?
I guess mine are more comments, but some of them are questions. I guess one of them, as we move forward, I have some notes on here. Department develop timelines for implementing the report, and if we can get the timelines and maybe quarterly updates to show where we were, where we are, what those improvements are. Because I tend to agree with the presentation when it comes to especially the training, especially performance reviews. We got to get up to speed on identifying goals and objectives and provide feedback back to the officers on the field so they know what they need to do for any manager. So I suspect there's going to be some significant training expended to do that. So probably some cost to let us know what it may take to do that. And also concerned with some of the communications. I'd like to see that addressed in the quarterly update, the vertical and horizontal, how that's working. As well, again, you touched on the properly sized, where that may come into place. Talking about it over a period of time, there was something else, departmental property size, develop performance reviews, I've touched on that. The other question and concern I have too is the differential between the under 10 years and over 10 years. And also within the actual development of timelines, implementing report, I don't know how, and maybe the team that did the study, how do you go back independently and see how that is changing? Because I really believe that's really critical for the department to move forward, to shrink those gaps between the under 10 years and the over 10 years. I guess maybe this is a question for you. How do we follow up on that to make sure that those gaps are shrinking?
Generally speaking, the approach to addressing that type of a question is that you have to identify for yourself what your metrics are. What outcomes do you want to see happen, and convert those to things that are measurable, so you can actually track progress over a period of time. And there are metrics available to look at generational changes, for example, in the workplace, and how you can kind of bring various generations together. So, as Jim correctly points out, despite the fact that there are generational differences, they are still bound together by certain important principles. But the answer to your question is looking at metrics, looking at measurements and outcomes, desired outcomes.
Is that something HR should be able to put together?
Well, I think the way that you look at that issue is it's a shared responsibility, and you need to bring together your leaders in both of those functional areas to start conversation about what those metrics ought to be.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that's got to be shrunk to succeed, so thank you.
Joanne?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for the thoroughness of this investigation, and I know that it's been a very serious issue for our city, and I know everyone involved has really done their best to sounds like to make it easy for you to conduct everything that you did. And but I have to tell you, when I came in here, my great hearing, I could have sworn Mr. Fishbach said, Mr. Davis, that you were from the Al Capone Police Department. And I had to actually look at your paper because he said it twice.
You want my hearing
Yeah,
aid?
I tell you, the 80s did me in. So it was the El Cajon. Anyway, okay. Many of my questions, quite frankly, go to management. And I would prefer a follow-up work session. I know with the amount of people that are here for other items, and the gravity of this whole situation is extremely important, and I think that we all want to put the best time that we can into it. But I do have really one question for you that I just want to feel reassured in my mind. Obviously, to me, there was a great deal of issues with training, communication, evaluation, things like that. But I saw, and from what I'm understanding, half of the items that you gave as recommendations, you, Chief, have said we are in the process of changing. And I just want to make sure that the recommendations that you stated anyway, because you saw that in the past this was an issue, and you didn't say it because he already said it's in place.
Nothing left out is what you're saying.
Well,
Nothing
exactly.
left out.
So you stated the recommendation anyway, even though you saw maybe a change now. But Do you
Well,
get my drift?
you know, without a doubt, I would say that one of the, in addition to the consistency of fairness, accountability, and leadership, one of the things that we also heard on a regular basis when we were asking our questions was the question, so do you mean then or now? Because people have been noticing a change, and people within the organization have been working for change, undoubtedly. As Steve pointed out when he started the presentation, this is a snapshot. So we're trying to get at what were the issues in the department. And understand that many of these things can't be changed overnight. Sure. That even when you set a policy, then that begins the process of establishing that policy as a tradition within the department that people internalize and follow, not because they have to, but because they want to.
Because it's sort of a culture you're going to break.
This is the Goodyear Police Department. This is what we believe in. This is what we do, and we're not going to accept any less.
Yeah.
I just asked the question because sometimes you'll make a recommendation. I'm not saying this is happening here, but you'll make a recommendation and somebody will say, oh, yes, that's in place. But it doesn't mean it ever happened. And so that's why I was questioning, do you have some of those recommendations laid out that even though they say they're in place, they just obviously weren't being followed? Did you see some of that?
I think I was with you until the last part of your question, because let me try and summarize this, and maybe Steve can come in here with this as well. I don't believe that anyone's trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes in this process.
I don't mean it that way.
Or do you think they left out something because they knew that it was in process? Are you just saying maybe some of the points that we have down there are points that maybe he eliminated some because he already knew they were in working with the department? Or do you mean, yeah, we're having a problem here with this.
No, sometimes, like if you look at a policies and procedures manual and it says we will do X, Y, and Z, and it's stated there, but it doesn't mean it's happening. And so you still give that recommendation that it needs to take place just because it's obvious it hasn't been occurring. You know, those are some of the items.
Certainly, and I think that's incorporated in the recommendation also, or the recommendations, that it is sort of covered in an overall umbrella process, in that any policy or procedure needs to be reviewed on a regular basis to be sure that what we say we will do, and if there's some reason to do that, not just because we did it 10 years ago and it's remained in the policy, but we review it. Are we still at that point? Do we need to change this? Do we need to make other policies? And I think you all are absolutely on the right track by getting professional help with writing a policy and procedure manual, because as an attorney, you know that that's a difficult process.
That was all. Thank you.
Wally.
My question is short because most of mine have already been answered, and I have more questions in the work session. But I want to thank you for your report. It's very thorough, and I was happy to see that you went outside the department and talked to some of our partners on how they perceive what our police are doing, and that they feel confident in our department as we want to feel, and we do feel. My question to you is, how detrimental is it that we have our police all over the city in different buildings? How important is it for us as a city to gather all of them together in one place?
Go ahead. You start and I'll fill in.
We did make a recommendation in the report, is that as time and resources become available to you, that you give consideration to having a single facility. We think that helps address a number of the management issues that we discovered. Again, we're realistic enough to understand the limitations of resources. It's not like you're going to build a building tomorrow or next week. But it's something I think in the long term, I think will be a substantial benefit to the community.
Okay, and my next question was to the chief. I know you brought some of them together. Can you just tell us quickly what you've done to open the communication up better?
Sure. I'd like to add just one quick comment
Please.
to the facilities. I have 138 project managers that would love to sit in and help out with that effort for a new facility. So some of the issues that we did recognize that there was a communication issue within the department. Some quick things that we did was I relocated the patrol lieutenants down to our 103 building to the main building, so we could bridge that gap of communication. Our lieutenants also attend briefings. And, you know, that was just the first, out of the gate, first 7 days that I was in office that I made that change. And it really has been helpful. I know we still have work to do as far as communication and vertical and horizontal both. But it seemed to me like the cry was, you know, we never know what's going on. Tell us what's happening in the organization. So that relocation was very vital to help open those communication efforts.
Is that your last question?
That's my last question, and I want to thank you, Chief, for all that you are doing and continue to do to bring us online. And
Thank you.
I do
It's a
want
new
to
day.
thank you, and thank you, Council, and all the presentation. I just want us to not to forget that this all began with the tragedy that took place on the streets of Goodyear when a young man named Jared Pendleton was killed. And we were all saddened at this loss of this young man, knowing the sorrow of his parents would suffer and his friends felt. And it was devastating, and it will linger with all of us for a long time. This is really what led to an investigation of our police department in regards to this entire case and how it was handled during the investigation of the death of this young man. So we had to be realistic and come to the table. And we saw that just what you were saying tonight, to leadership, the conduct, consistency, accountability, the performances, best practices were just few of the things that we were missing, and we have discovered through your investigation of Citygate, and we really, truly appreciate that. People criticized us for money we spent. It was money well spent. It's our future. It's our future for our children. It's the safety of our city. And then lastly, Interim Chief Police Bill Kusan, you have done a solid job. You have come into this under very difficult circumstances. You knew the people you were dealing with intimately, so it must have been very difficult for you. Some of the people that were involved were your friends. Some of the decision you had to make, you really in your heart felt badly for them, but you took this job on honorably. And I can't say enough about what you've done for our city. So I trust you. I feel like we're going to get through this. I feel like when we interview for the new police chief, how we got that, chief of police, I think that we're going to find someone that is very capable. And most of all, we have you that is going to be beside him, helping him to understand our culture, to help change the culture. So I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank the city manager for taking the police department under your wing, bringing them under you. I think that helps speed up the investigation and all the things that we were confronted with. So once again, I thank you. And I think we're going to adjourn this meeting, and we're going to need about 5 minutes to clear the table, maybe 8 minutes, whatever it takes to go back up the dais. So thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.
Great job, Jim. Thank you.
Good job, Bill.